So Beth, thank you so much for coming on to COLLAF Conversations.
It's a pleasure. It's great to be here.
Oh, brilliant. It's funny because actually I realised most of the people I've spoken to on this podcast so far came into the art world quite a bit later. So it wasn't something that they initially realised they were passionate about, but I know that you started from a pretty young age.
Yeah.
How did it start?
I mean, I think I always knew that I wanted to work in the art world. I did not know in what capacity or what form, remembering I'm of a certain age. And so when I came to studying in London, it was the 90s. So I first came to London in 94, and I'd been brought up in Cheshire, which is not known for its sort of cutting edge cultural heritage. However, I was on the doorstep of Manchester. I had Liverpool, and Tate Liverpool had recently opened when I was a child. So, and I had great art teachers. So I'd always engaged in art as a way of trying to understand the world.
Okay.
And I just knew that I wanted to immerse myself in some shape or form with artists or art history. And so graduated, as I say, in the 90s from an art history degree in London. And London was always a place that I wanted to be.
Okay.
With all of the great institutions and museums that you could surround yourself with. And I think my career took many twists and turns along the way. And I was lucky to meet incredible people early on in my career. I developed from that.
And when we met, I remember you making a comment about not liking to be described as a curator. There's a bit of discomfort around that. Why is that?
I think the word curator is overused and not fully understood. The role of a curator comes with great responsibility. And historically, you were a curate at a church or a religious establishment. And today, everybody curates, from my pub curating the cheese board to. But that not said, I don't want to be flippant about it, because there are some incredible curatorial courses, and the idea of curatorship is now much more rigorous than it has been in the past. But when I graduated, I think there was one curating course that had only just been established at the Royal College of Art. Now, the Curator, for example, offers curating courses, and that's only within recent years. I just think it's an overused term, and one has to be careful. And I wear so many hats, and my client base is wide ranging. I advise collectors to purchase work. I'm building collections, and I do to a degree curate them, but I'm just very careful about the word. I think it's very loaded.
I completely agree, and I think it's actually one of the questions I get asked most by people who aren't in the art world or don't know much about it, is what actually is a curator?
I think a curatorial practice is really rigorous. It involves lots of research, lots of thinking, lots of talking, lots of looking, and it's about unpicking narratives and relationships and connections across artists' practices, but also across histories and across geographies as well. I mean, I'd love to spend all of my life looking at work and talking to artists and creating exhibitions or publications or whatever it may be, but I think it's a research-based role that one has to commit to wholeheartedly. Whereas my career is very, it's quite unusual. I have a portfolio of clients. As I say, many of them are private art collectors, but a lot of my collectors also want to activate their collections. And so that does involve some sort of curating of the objects within. And obviously when I'm building collections, you have to think of them as a whole. So you do sort of create these networks within them. But then I also have clients who are startup businesses or commercial galleries or artist estates, thinking about legacy planning and things like that.
And when you're activating collections,
yeah.
So is that normally in an exhibition format or like loaning works?
It can take so many different forms. I mean, it depends on the collector and it depends on the collection as well, and the contents of a collection. But some recent examples are long-term loans of items to museums, because a number of my clients are really keen to share their collections with as many people as possible. And they're also very receptive to how institutions, especially in the UK, are feeling threatened from budgetary point of views. I have other clients who do want to curate exhibitions, who want to support individual artists, and that will involve hosting exhibitions, commissioning artwork. And then I have another, for example, the Sunderland collection, which is a collection of maps, atlases, and books of knowledge. And with that collection, I've devised an art programme.
Yes.
So we invite living artists to respond to the collection of historic objects. And that can be a sort of up to 2 years of just spending time with the objects, with the cartographic experts.
So is that an annual kind of?
Yeah, so we've had 2 iterations so far. That we launched the programme with an artist called Fatih Hassan. He spent a year looking at the objects, and it resulted in an exhibition at number 20 Cork Street, so Freeze's space. We commissioned new work for that exhibition, produced a beautiful catalogue, panel discussions, and that's the sort of model. So each artist spends time, and ultimately there will be an exhibition.
In terms of choosing those artists, do you go out and find them, or are they coming to the Sunderland collection? Or
so far we've sought out the artists ourselves. So artists that we think might be interested in maps and the history of cartography. And what I found is pretty much every artist that we have highlighted or thought might be vaguely interested is wholeheartedly interested in maps. It's
maps are a passion.
It really is. I think because there's so many different entry points as well in terms of what might spark one's imagination or interest in maps, whether it's political, whether it's geographical, whether it's about the mediums and about the processes, or even, all of the marginalia and the windheads and the sea monsters. There's something for everybody with maps.
Do you think there's still an issue with artists being overlooked due to, race, class, where they live in the world? Do you think there is still an issue in that, and how can it be redressed?
I think there's still huge issues. I think we've come leaps and bounds within the art world and the art market. Our institutions have been readdressing their collections for a number of years. In the UK, many of our collections, are readdressing geographic discriminations and cultural discriminations that have been embedded within their collections historically. For me, I do a lot of work with women artists and women in the art world, and trying to support them, because there is still great gender bias. Even though many of the institutions that we, are so proud of in the UK, for example, are run by women, there is still gender bias within the collections. And that's that's due to a historical bias. There's still so much work to do, but thankfully we've started on that journey. How can we do more? I think is continue to support artists across all geographies and identities. I think we're really particularly challenged at the moment with language that's being used politically, not wanting to get into a political conversation, but I think a lot of the good work that we have done in recent years is being threatened by new world politics, and that I think is something that we have to be very, very aware of, and we have to stand up to.
No, definitely. I think it's also a great thing that I think there's been a surge of collectors also trying, collectors who may have, you know, moved to the UK as an example, who are actually thinking about where they originally came from and thinking, actually, I would really like to help represent artists from those areas too.
Yeah.
You know, whether that's South Asian artists or South American artists, Middle Eastern. But I think that's something that's been really helpful.
I think hugely helpful. You know, remembering that I've been working with some of my collectors for 20 years, over 20 years. You know, and historically I'd always said to them, women are completely underrepresented in all of our collections, in our national collections, in our international collections. There was a huge gap there. You know, and 20 years ago, the market was diabolical for women. We still don't have gender parity, and women are still misrepresented or underrepresented. So there is a lot of work to be done there. But you know, my clients or my collectors who I've worked with all of those years are very grateful now to have been at the forefront of collecting women artists.
Yeah. So I know that you famously worked with David Bowie.
Yeah.
And did you manage the collection or curate the collection?
Oh, I was called Curator, but again, it's in a very loose way.
Because I heard that by the time you'd started, he'd already sort of started building.
He had a very big collection when I came on board.
Okay.
The collection was too big for him to house personally, and he was so passionate about the artists that he collected and considered them underrepresented, which meant that he was very keen to share the collection with as many people as possible. So a lot of my work was involved, you know, opening up the collection to institutions, for example. He would rotate work at home, so we would move things around. But by the time I started working with David, he'd recently moved to New York. Much of the collection, because it was very British, or some of the big chunk of it was British modernism was here. But we did many projects together. I mean, he was also taught me an awful lot about not just sharing the collection, but also supporting artists and activating collections. So we did lots of projects with young emerging artists, for example.
That was actually one of my questions that I was coming on to, was about, I know that you previously mentioned that David suggested that it was always important to not follow trends. From that, what did you learn as kind of a criteria for finding new artists?
Well, I think David, he very openly talked about his collection as sort of being parochial. That was a word that he would use in a very tongue-in-cheek sort of a way. You know, he would think of a world famous rock star as collecting British modernism from the Camden School to St. Ives. You know, it wasn't fashionable, it wasn't trendy, especially when he was collecting. But he had a deep-rooted passion for these artists because they were actually revolutionaries in their time, and they were changing the trajectory of British art history. So when you think of it from that point of view, you know, they aligned very much with what David himself was doing and with, you know, his purpose and passion. But he taught me to just keep looking, like to never stop looking, to allow one artist to lead you to another, to ask the questions. He was a incredible researcher, so he'd spend so much time reading and talking and, you know, finding obscure publications about artists or old catalogues and things. You know, a lot of his knowledge came from researching artists and artists' histories.
For you, I mean, obviously, because art is such a physical thing that you have to look at, there is an element of, you do obviously have to physically like the piece. But how important for you is the messaging or the history behind an artwork, and like the artist's motive behind the artwork, and also for your clients?
Well, the clients that I work with, the collectors that I work with, are building collections with significance both personally and I think within a wider context. I think every art collection is a personal collection, or certainly the collections that I want to work with are very personal collections. We use art to position ourselves, I think, or to understand our place in the world. And so I think it's really important to understand what resonates with a collector and why. That's why I always think we feel very honoured to be invited into that conversation as well, because it's such a personal thing to collect art and to build collections that talk to your own history. So I think the message is really important.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, quality is vital.
Quality is vital, but
there's so many different. I talk about this a lot. There's so many different sort of value systems within art and artist practices, and they resonate on so many different levels. So it's finding the right balance.
Have you personally ever seen an artwork where you haven't? There's nothing about the physical piece that really appealed to you or attracted you, but then understanding any messaging behind the piece, something made you completely change
all the time.
Really,
all the time. I think, I also think when you meet artists and you discuss practices with artists, or you discuss the work that they're making and what motivates them, and they're able to open doors into a better understanding. I think that's a hugely valuable experience. Yeah. I often see work that I think is conceptually brilliant, or the messaging is brilliant. It might not resonate with me on an emotional level, but that's not to say it's not great work.
For sure,
it's a personal thing.
Yeah, I remember when I sat with Andrew Renton, he mentioned that one of the things they really teach. He is actually a professor of curation, and he said that one of the main things they teach is they can't teach an artist to be a good artist, but they can teach them to articulate what their work is about, which actually adds an enormous amount of value to it.
Yeah. I also think, I had this conversation recently, how do you know it's good art? And there is something inherent in those of us who have looked for a very long time, and you can know quite quickly whether it's a good work, but you have to I feel like you have to articulate why, because that adds another level, and it gives you another further insight and depth of understanding that I think is really, really important.
Yeah.
And most artworks, I find, like, I've lived with work and my clients have lived with work, and their relationship with each object changes over time, because we change as human beings and our relationship with the world changes. And so we might see something in a painting or a sculpture, whatever it may be, at the age of 20 that has shifted by the age of 40 or 50, or of course, it's what you bring to it as well, I think.
When you start with most collectors, are they sort of at the beginning of their journey or mid?
Well, as I said, some of the clients I've worked with are sort of for 20 or 30 years. So
yes. So that was at the start.
Yes, in the main.
And are they...
In fact, pretty much in every instance, yes.
Really?
Apart from David.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are they coming to you with their own kind of vision in mind, or do you kind of help them build it and say, where's your interest, and try and give them different, types of art, different periods to go on, and
It's a bit of both. It's a bit of both. So when we embark on building a collection, in the main, or in usually we will sit down for months and months, even longer, and just look at work together and talk about what resonates and what motivates people. Like somebody may come to me and say, I really like black and white photography. That's a great starting point. But the history of black and white photography is is vast. So we spend a lot of time looking, exploring, opening up all of those doors and going into those dusty corners.
Yeah.
And, with time, you formulate a better idea as to what motivates, what resonates, and it's a two-way conversation.
Something that I find interesting as well is because the art world is such kind of it's a hub that people kind of know about but don't really know what goes on unless you're already in it. Do you have people who want to start collecting to try and like understand more about the actual art world and be involved in it? And do a lot of collectors say, actually, I don't want anything to do with it, I just want to collect some art?
No, I think everybody that I work with tends to want to be involved in some shape or form to better understand it. The clients that I work with are hugely inquisitive, and ultimately enjoy being a part of the art world and everything that it offers, because the art world is made up of really passionate, knowledgeable people at all levels. So I think there are many problems with the art market in its lack of transparency. I mean, it's getting much, much better, but it has historically been quite a protectionist model, with many barriers that have been put up. So entry is not always easy, whether that's based on class or gender or, financial capability.
Yes.
And that saddens me. And I'm always very, very happy to share my experiences and my network and try and open up the art world for people. I think it should be much more open.
That's
space.
the point of these conversations,
right?
Letting people hear and have an insight into
exactly.
And as a woman in the art world, obviously for an incredible career, how do you feel since you started the role of women in art has changed?
It's changed. Okay. I think there's still a lot to be done. I think it was tricky when I started out in the 90s as a woman, not really knowing what I wanted to do, but knowing that I wanted to work with artists and I wanted to be surrounded by art. I graduated in the 90s, as I said, when the YBAs were disrupting the art scene in the UK, and there were many really strong women who were forging their own space and making space for women. There was also at that point a number of commercial galleries that were being set up and initiated by women. I think it's Sadie Coles, Maureen Paley, amazing women. Many of the institutions, there were more women appearing. But on the flip side, we still had a secondary market that was run by white, wealthy men. I remember, peers of mine leaving the courtauld who went to work in auction houses, and women were not allowed to wear trousers. I mean, that to me is just mind-blowing.
Mind-blowing.
It's insane. I was listening to something on Radio 4 this morning as I was driving here, about women across the creative industries who did not have doors opened for them. You had to be bold and you had to be persistent. But thankfully, I think that is changing. We've still got a long way to go, and there is still a lot of work that needs to be done for women wanting to carve out a career in the art world. But we're getting there, and thankfully we're having these conversations.
Definitely. So how did you get your role? Because David, was that one of your first roles working for David?
Yes, and that was via somebody who was already working with him. So Kate Shatavian and David had been working for a good few years together, building the collection before I came on board. So I graduated in 97, and I was working with Kate by 98, 99, I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. And obviously that was with David. Kate stepped back and I took over that role.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Have there been any moments in your career where you thought actually that was a learning curve?
Oh, I do think it's a learning curve. I think one should walk through your career taking learnings at every single step. I think it's really, really important to do. Where the moments that have been particularly challenging is another way of framing it, I guess. And I think there have been many. I think one of the most challenging things was overseeing the sale of David's collection the year that he died in 2016. That was a huge, it's emotionally challenging.
I'm sure.
But also wanting to do the absolute best by David without having David to answer any of my questions.
Of course.
So taking the responsibility of presenting that collection and the motivations behind the collection and his thinking behind the collection and presenting it to a huge audience who didn't necessarily know David as an art collector. They knew him as something else. So that I think was, I felt huge responsibility, and I had to keep check of myself to make sure that I was doing the absolute best by David, by the artist, by the collection, and also by the estate, of course.
Yeah. And no, it's interesting because, there must have been, it sounds like an incredible amount of thought into each work that was acquired by David and how it was curated and managed. And then once it goes on sale and, it goes anywhere, it's a really tough thing to have to do.
But David always said he was only ever custodian of these items.
Yeah.
He was taking care of them in his lifetime. I mean, I think that's rather a nice way of thinking about
really
it.
Nice way of thinking about it.
I do think it's really important to think about the legacy of collections. So one should take that responsibility on board early on in your collecting, I think. Because these are items that are going to outlive you. These are really significant, important cultural objects that will have a life beyond you. So thinking about what that looks like in your lifetime is, I think, vital.
Do you think, just you personally, do you think it's more like a beautiful legacy to keep a collection together, or actually to let it go and see where it takes it naturally?
It's a super interesting question and a conversation that I have frequently. It costs an awful lot of money to keep a collection together beyond your lifetime.
Of course.
Obviously, there are many great examples of collections being gifted to institutions or foundations being set up to enable the upkeep of collections beyond one's lifetime. Collections, good collections are brought together with thought and care and integrity, and and often are brought together to tell a story.
Mm-hmm.
If that story is a valuable story that future generations will benefit from, I think that's great. I was at Pallant House this week in Chichester, which is one of my favourite museums. And that is a really interesting collection of collections. And I think and there's no institution like that in the UK, not with a depth of collections. So there's sort of 5 key private collections that are pretty much gifted in their entirety to Pallant House. And they all work strangely because of the stewardship of Simon Martin, the director, who's been the director of the institution for 25 years. He brings things in that draw lines across all of those collections, which is an incredible skill to achieve.
I think it's very dependent. It's dependent on the collection and its capabilities. Ultimately, if you can keep it together, that's great. There's also kind of a beauty of letting the art go and seeing where it takes it. Just naturally is also nice. I think and I think it's also very dependent on the collection itself. As you said, if it's something that tells a story together and really fits, there's a great value in keeping it together. If it's more random works or maybe just a collection of works, but there's not really any linkage between them all, you know, wherever they go, that the pieces speak for themselves individually.
Yeah.
In that sense.
Yeah. No, beautifully put.
If there was one art world buzzword or trend that you really would like to
I can't keep up with art world buzzwords. I think they change
or something you hear that you
annually. Do you know what? I would just love for art speak to become less buzzy, in all honesty.
Yeah.
I think all of those buzzwords actually build barriers to accessibility. So I'd prefer us all just to speak quite plainly about art.
I think so too. I think it's part of the intimidation around art is the language that we use to discuss it.
There was a brilliant artwork by the collective called Bank, who would receive press releases from commercial galleries, from institutions, and then they'd fax them back to the said institutions with their handwritten notes. Right, and they'd circle buzzwords and say that just doesn't make any sense. And now it's in the Tate collection.
But it really, how funny. But it's true. I think, unfortunately, even when you go to museums and galleries and you read the boards to explain, and you read it, you go, I don't even understand.
There's so many redundant words.
Be more simply put.
Yeah.
So that I think the art world nowadays does feel though slightly less academic in some ways. Do you agree? Like a little bit more experiential?
Well, I think something's happened in the last sort of 20, 25 years around commercialization of the art world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has reduced academic rigor. You know, the engagement with the art world is on a different register. I think there's still plenty of people who are very academic about the art world. I mean, I'm still heavily involved with the Courtauld, for example.
Yes.
But I think the commercialization of the art world has probably shifted the way that or many people approach it.
Is that a bad thing?
I think we have to realise and remember that the ecosystem has got bigger and bigger over generations, and there's lots of different players or elements that all interact. I think it's become a more complicated place. So no, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think there's place for all of those different responses to art.
Do you think in that way it has become more accessible?
Well, certainly in the UK.
Yes.
I mean, I think, yes, absolutely. We've become more accessible. We've become slightly more open. There's an internationalization of the art world, which we must celebrate because we have access to much wider art practices. So yeah, I think absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Oh, pleasure.
That was a really great conversation. Thank you.